Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government for today's event, Can We Trust Our Electoral System? Nice, easy question to answer on a Wednesday lunchtime. I'm Gavin Freeguard, Programme Director for Data and Digital Government here at the Institute, and it's wonderful to welcome so many of you today. Forget Labour's NHS announcement, forget the SNP manifesto launch, forget even the YouGov poll we're all waiting for tonight. This is the place to be on the election trail today. Some housekeeping before we get underway. We are on the record today and we are live streaming, so hello to anybody watching us online. If you'd like to get involved in the online conversation, we're using the hashtag IFGElection2019 and tweeting from @IFGEvents. For those of you in the room, you can get online using the details at the top of our slide. It's the IFG Internet hotspot with the password Institute123. No fire drills are planned, so if there is a fire alarm, please vacate this room as quickly as possible, using the stairs and not the lift, and very specifically head for the statue of King George VI outside, not the one of Queen Elizabeth. So that's out of the building, turn to the right. If we do have a first aid incident, I will also ask you to clear the room as swiftly as possible. Our electoral laws are not fit for purpose. Political campaigns are fought online, not through the letterbox, and our laws need to be brought up to date with the digital age. Those are the words of Damian Collins, then the chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, as he called for urgent legislation to protect the UK's electoral system. Technology has transformed how elections unfold in the 21st century. Everything from how political parties use our data, how campaigns target us, and how we all consume information about parties and policies. Technology may also present opportunities as well as threats. But has electoral law kept pace with all of those developments? Can we trust our electoral system? Well, we've got an incredible panel to answer those questions and more today. First, we'll hear from Will Moy, who is the Chief Executive of the UK's independent fact-checking charity, Full Fact, not to be confused with Fact Check UK. Accept no imitations. Full Fact has long called for changes to electoral law. Just this September, they wrote to parliamentarians calling for legislation covering the transparency of online campaigning, online advertising, and a protocol for alerting the public to major interference. We'll then hear from Liz Carolan. Liz is the Executive Director of Digital Action, which works to strengthen democratic rights in a digital age through building coalitions that can tackle digital threats. She was one of the co-founders of the Transparent Referendum Initiative, which worked on the 8th Amendment abortion referendum in Ireland, campaigning for an open referendum there and building a database of political ads. She's previously worked at the Open Data Charter, the Open Data Institute, and here at the Institute for Government. We'll then hear from Dr. Martin Moore, Director of the Centre for the Study of Communication, Media and Power, and Senior Lecturer in Political Communication Education at King's College London. He's also the author of the recent book Democracy Hacked, How Technology is Destabilising Global Politics, which looks at the impact of data miners, dark ads, bots, and so much more on our democratic processes. Before joining King's, Martin was the founding director of the charity, the Media Standards Trust, where, full disclosure, he had the great misfortune to be my boss. And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from Sir John Holmes, the chair of the Electoral Commission, the independent body which oversees elections and regulates political finance here in the UK. Sir John is a highly experienced diplomat. His career has included advising prime ministers, including John Major and Tony Blair. He's been the ambassador to both Lisbon and Paris, and was also appointed the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. The Electoral Commission itself has long called for reform of our electoral system, including some greater powers around compelling information from third parties. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to speak for around 5 minutes. Time permitting, we'll have a quick discussion on the panel, and then we'll throw it out to you, the audience, for questions. This event will end after 1 hour, so please keep any questions short and sharp, and we'll aim to end at around 1:30. So without further ado, Will.
Can we trust our electoral system? Yes, more than some people think. Over the next 2 weeks, Full Fact, we can already anticipate, we'll be dealing with a whole series of misinformation about where your polling station is, whether or not you should vote with a pencil because somebody, it's never quite clear who, is going to rub out your cross and put it somewhere else, and all the rest of it. There is a lot of fear about our electoral system. We shouldn't contribute to groundless fears in discussions like this. We need to tackle them. We need to maintain faith in our electoral system. Doing that is partly through scrutiny, through an open democratic process, and that open democratic process is currently failing. These are the reasons we cannot trust our electoral system. We have agreed as a country principles that govern the way we do elections. We agree that you should not be able to interfere in a UK election from outside the UK. That's in the Representation of the People's Act. So you cannot broadcast from outside the UK into the UK in order to interfere with an election. That's known as the Lord Hoare rule. It goes back to German propaganda. We agree that you should put your name on your campaign materials so it's clear who's making them. That's the imprint rule. Neither of these are particularly surprising. We also agree that advertising in an election is a powerful force and that it should be regulated and it should be scrutinised. In fact, television advertising in the UK is banned, something that has been litigated as far as the European Courts of Human Rights. All of these things are important accepted principles and none of them have been updated in the online world. There is no requirement in online campaigning to put your name on what you are producing. In fact, as we've seen in this election, you can put somebody else's name on what you're producing and legally at least be on safe ground. There is no requirement for online advertising to be capable, and I do mean capable, of being scrutinised by your political opponents or by third parties. That is now a massive gap in the scrutiny and integrity of our election system. And of course, we are wide open to foreign interference. I should say at the moment that we have not seen credible reports of serious levels of hostile state action in this election. We and others with more experience in this area are monitoring for those kinds of threats, but we do know that this is a standard part of the repertoire of certain states and that any sensible modern democracy has to be prepared for them. In Canada, for example, before they had their election this year, they created a protocol for warning the public about serious levels of foreign interference or hostile state action, and that protocol was established to be run by civil servants independently of political decision makers. We have no such process. So if the skilled and capable civil servants who are currently in charge of monitoring for this kind of interference and disinformation were to detect something, we would be in a situation where politicians were having to make the call about whether or not to tell the public and in what way. That is, at best, suboptimal. So we have a series of gaps before we even get onto anything controversial, a series of gaps in understood principles no longer applying because the law has not been updated since the last century. The bigger point is this. Everybody agrees on some of these updates. Everybody agrees that the imprint law should be extended online, for example. The Electoral Commission asked for this, I think, first around 15 years ago. We've been talking about it for several years. The Institute for Practitioners in Advertising agrees on the need to improve and legislate for online advertising transparency. Even Facebook has called for Parliament to act in this area, and yet they haven't. The long-term threat to the electoral integrity of the United Kingdom is the fecklessness of successive governments and parliaments who are well aware of and who have explicitly acknowledged the risk here, but have done nothing to address it. We know that in the next 30 years, we will continually be living in an ever-changing information environment, and the nature of the threats to election integrity will continue to change. The nature of the actors involved in our elections will continue to change. And at the moment, as a country, we have decided to outsource decisions about the election rules we have to the CEOs of American internet companies. And that's an extraordinary and an extraordinarily irresponsible thing to have done. So if we want to have election integrity right now, we should have done, as Damien Collins said, emergency legislation before this election, at least to insist on transparency of campaigning and transparency on advertising. If we want to have election integrity for future elections, we need a regular process of reviewing and updating our election law as the world changes around us. And in doing that, we need to see continued investment in the Electoral Commission, which for too long did not have the resources to properly advise in this area and to keep pace with changes and to help Parliament in this area. We need to see them properly resourced to be our guide through these threats and these opportunities as well.
Thank you, Will. Liz.
Thanks. Well, I'm not going to disagree with anything Will said.
Excellent.
It's all very sensible. I mean, I would just add that it's not just the UK who's struggling to deal with this. I'm based in Ireland, and we actually don't even have an election commission. It's sort of like the UK was before, where elections are governed by local government, but we are in the process of developing one in every government manifesto for about the last but they promise me it's coming. But which is quite exciting, because I think we do fundamentally need to rethink electoral administration in the digital age that we live in. But I think Gavin asked me here to talk, I think, mostly about an example of a project I did last year, which helps, I think, just put a bit of flesh on the bones of the threats that Will mentioned. So you may remember last year Ireland had a referendum on whether or not to legalise abortion access in Ireland. We love referendums. I think we've had 2 or 3 since, because we have quite a strong written constitution. But during that, you know, the particular dynamics of this referendum indicated that it was likely that there was going to be both a huge amount of funding going into this campaign, and also there was a lot of interest from overseas groups who have traditionally used Ireland's ban on abortion as a sort of symbolic, as having symbolic meaning elsewhere. And so when the aftermath of the US the US presidential election of 2016 was sort of playing out in Congress, and there was all of this emphasis on the direct overseas purchase of political ads in order to influence that election. Some colleagues and I got together and worked with Who Targets Me to sort of build a scraped database of the ads that were circulating during the referendum campaign. We were able to find about 1,500 separate ads, which, as Will was saying, would not have been in the public domain were it not for the 900 or so volunteers who were helping us to scrape and publish these ads. And there's a few characteristics of those that I think are relevant for when we're thinking about whether or not our electoral laws are fit. And I think that the key one to me is that the nature of digital campaigning enables anybody, anywhere to pretend that they are anybody that they want to be, and to pay money in order to try and influence public discourse. And so what we saw in Ireland was kind of precursors to some of the things that we're seeing in the UK at the moment. Campaigns being set up which are not connected to any of the official campaigns, where toxic or polarizing or bullying messages are able to be pushed out without any ability to trace who is behind that, and any connection that it may or may not have to legitimate campaigns. We also saw mimicry or impersonation of neutral accounts, which were driving people towards websites, with names like Undecided on the 8th, but which were entirely biased. And I think as well, one of the we've been doing some work in other elections since, and I think one of the most sort of worrying potential aspects of this type of campaigning is the potential for it to be used as part of kind of voter suppression tactics. We know from people who work inside political campaigns that you don't necessarily use a digital campaign to sway people's opinion one way or another. You use it in order to mobilize people to get them to the polls. And we saw during US 2020 that there was deliberate targeting of ethnic minorities, sort of saying, we don't trust either candidate, there's no point in voting, some of these kind of boycott campaigns. During the recent European elections, I think ISD, who were here, and others found some examples of these type of boycott campaigns targeting people in the Baltic states and in Spain, and I think we're going to see a huge amount of that in 2020. Again, how do we begin to think about those outside of the context of mainstream political parties, and where people have, it's no good as finding out that these activities are taking place after an election has happened. I think there are a couple of opportunities, though, in the recent changes to technology for better governance of elections. So, for example, one of my favorite parts of the Election Commission website is where you can download spending data to really quite a granular level, down to the level where you can see receipts. for people who have done expenditure. There's no reason why, with all of the financial transactions that are taking place for digital political campaigning being concentrated in 2 or 3 companies, there's no reason why we can't have very real-time transparency by private companies of the transactions that are taking place on their sites. That gets us beyond the sort of thresholds for when people need to be reporting. It takes the burden off parties to be trying to sort of put things out in real time, and it puts it on companies who have a stake in still being around in 5 or 10 years' time, where many pop-up groups may not. Lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Liz. Martin.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I suppose to start with reiterating something that said, which is that there are significant challenges to democratic systems all around the world. This is not peculiar to this country by any means. I think we're in the process of a huge transformation of the media and communication system, and as that system is being transformed, so are our politics, and particularly so is campaigning. But there are, I think, some particular challenges to the British system, and given our discussion, I'll just point to those. And I'd just like to outline 5 particular ways that I think the new digital environment is undermining the legitimacy of our political system. I'll just list them and then I'll go through each. The first is in terms of undermining the secrecy of the vote. The second is in terms of undermining the protection of the citizens from undue influence. The third is maintaining a fair and level playing field. The fourth is preventing elections from being bought. And the fifth is allowing citizens to properly scrutinise the advertising propaganda that's being targeted at them. So to each of those, I mean, if you look at, I'll just very briefly look at each of those. If you look at the first, in terms of the secrecy of the vote, there's a remarkable paper by Kaczynski and Stilwell in 2013, which found that it was on US voters, 58,000 US voters, found that you could predict with 85% accuracy what people were going to vote based on, that was based on their Facebook likes, but they've since found that it can be done with all manner of different digital traces. It's becoming easier and easier to figure out how people are going to vote, even if they don't stick it in their profile on their Twitter or Facebook profile. And not only does that allow for particular types of targeting, it also leads directly to my next point about the protection from undue influence. So what we've seen increasingly, especially outside the UK, but increasingly in the UK as well, is people being targeted by online groups, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes more anonymously, mobbed essentially, harassed. This is not just public figures, although we've seen in this election a whole number of people step down and explicitly say that it was as a consequence of the abuse that they were being targeted with over the course of the campaign, but it's happening to almost anyone who chooses to step forward and say things that are political or offensive to another group. And those are being sort of marshalled in a both formal and informal way online, which is, I think, directly comparable in some ways to what we saw really in the 19th century, which we tried to legislate against, couping, treating, bribery, etc. in the early 19th century. The third is around maintaining a level playing field, and many of you will probably know about this, but we saw this particularly first in 2015, where it's extremely difficult now to figure out exactly how much is being spent at a local level. Candidates are supposed to spend between £10,000 and £16,000, depending on the size and scale of the constituency. What's been happening, particularly, I mean, it's always happened to a certain extent, but particularly since 2015, we've seen very, very targeted online campaigns at constituencies where significant amounts are being spent. So in 2015, the Conservatives spent £1.2 million on Facebook alone. They were very explicit subsequently that money was targeted pretty much at 23 constituencies, most of them in the southwest, with very divisive ads about a coalition with the SNP and a coalition of chaos. All that money, as far as I can tell, and I've looked into it, was charged to the central budget, not to the constituency budget. And therefore, ostensibly, it looks as though the candidates spent within their limits, but and it falls within the current law. But in terms of the principle of the law, it completely undermines the purpose of it. Preventing elections from being bought It's increasingly straightforward to spend a huge amount of money prior to an official regulated period, particularly in terms of data, in terms of building up a database, organizing that database, developing models for that database, and figuring out how to target. That gives you a significant advantage when it comes to the regulated period itself. And that is entirely separate from the other problem, which is sourcing the funding, which again is becoming harder and harder to do, even when Facebook insists that you are located within the UK. You can just set up a shell company and direct money through the shell company. And then finally, enabling voters to evaluate election material themselves. Will's already spoken to this, but we're seeing significant amounts of not just advertising, but news being targeted at people. And it's extremely difficult for people to work out whether it has been paid for, who it's been paid for on behalf of, whether it's not paid for at all. And this is complicated further, of course, by the degree to which the lowering of the hurdles to participation within election campaigns has been such that there's huge numbers of other people and other organisations participating, and the legislation is not built to cope with the number of non-party or third-party participants. So I'll finish there, but just to say that I think it would be, certainly to me at least, given what everyone's talked about already, given the degree to which I think most people are in agreement that the current laws are very outdated, given the degree to which you can bypass some of the protections that currently exist to try and keep the legitimacy of elections. Given that I think we've already seen many people try to bypass those protections in a legal and non-legal way, I would be enormously surprised if after this election you didn't get quite a large number of people from all sides questioning the legitimacy of the outcome.
Thank you, Martin. Sir John.
Thank you. Well, let me just start with a sort of positive note, building on what Will said at the beginning, because I think whatever the levels of distrust in politicians or political parties, I think we can trust the electoral system itself. And I agree with Will, we should be very careful not to undermine it by what we're saying and give people distrust that is not justified. Let me just give you 6 reasons to be cheerful before I go on to some less positive notes. One is that there is actually, for the moment at least, broad compliance with election rules. There are exceptions to that, but essentially there is broad compliance. Secondly, so far at least, and I hear the warning you're giving there, Martin, results of elections and referendums have not been challenged. They've not been liked often, but they haven't been actually challenged on the basis that the process has somehow been fixed. Thirdly, voting and counting of votes is carried out with great transparency and rigour, and having seen it at close quarters, you can't fix it. Fourthly, our elections are generally free from intimidation and major scandal. Not always true in lots of other countries. Fifthly, we do have one of the most transparent electoral regimes, particularly financial regimes in the world, where money, for the moment at least, still plays a relatively limited role, largely because of this ban on TV advertising, but as you say, online tends to blur that line, and that's something that we're looking at. And fifthly, the public confidence in elections and voting and so on is actually at pretty high levels. It's between 80 and 90% when we do surveys after elections. I say, whatever they think of politicians, they think that the process of voting has been okay for them. Now, having said that, we're not at all complacent about this. There's a huge amount of change and modernisation needed in our system. We've been saying that for many years, and I'll go on to make some of those points. But let's not lose sight of the underlying point, that for the moment at least, the system, the electoral system, the election process which we're in the moment is worthy of trust. Let me just say, by the way, that the figures we've had in the last few days or last weeks about registration are rather encouraging. Of course, it's not a proxy for trust, but it's a proxy for engagement at least. So we've seen, I think, 3.85 million people go onto the registers or apply to go onto the registers since the election was announced, which is quite a lot more than was the case certainly in 2015 and 2017. Now, there's a problem with that because not all of those people who've applied or weren't on the register already. There's a significant proportion of duplicates there, which is one of the reasons why the system is modernising. But still, I think that's an encouraging sign. Okay, on the less good news front, so 2 main points, if you like, to start with. One is that our electoral law is fundamentally unfit for purpose. It's not new, but it's just getting more and more obvious that that's the case. That's not just because of the new digital challenges which we're going to be talking about, and it's not just because also that the financial rules also need updating. I mean, the point you're making, Martin, about the split between local and central spending, local and party spending, is clearly unsatisfactory and needs tackling, but that's what the legislation says at the moment. But in any case, leaving those things aside, electoral law is voluminous, it's inconsistent, it's extremely difficult to operate for those who actually run the elections, and it needs changing. Recommendations have been made to do that, but it hasn't happened so far. The second point is we do really need to modernise our system and bring it, slowly at least, into the digital age. The registration system is a good example of that. We have 380 separate electoral registers in this country which don't speak to each other. You can't interrogate them collectively. You can't, for example, look up whether you're registered already. You can't look up how many people are registered in 2 different places. So these are things we could fix, but so far we haven't fixed. So there's a real issue there. And the register is the basis of lots of other things. If you ever want to go on to digital voting, which we're a long way from, or anything like that, you need to have the register fixed first and made more modern. But obviously the main issue we're discussing today, and a huge challenge for all of us, is how we deal with the new technology, how we deal with digital campaigning. And even though a lot of our regulatory work is actually after the elections, looking particularly at expenditure by parties and campaigners, and even though we don't have any role in controlling the content of campaigns, and we don't have any role in, for example, controlling the use of data, that's for the Information Commissioner's Office, we do try to focus as closely as we can on what's happening in the campaigns. That's both physically what's happening in terms of rallies and posters and leaflets and so on, but also online, without trying to say in any way that we have the capacity to monitor the whole of the internet. We certainly don't. But what we try to do is 4 things, if you like. One is to make sure we're helping parties and other campaigns as much as we can to comply with the rules by giving them advice whenever we can. The second is following the money, publishing what we can about money in real time. We publish donations in real time during the elections on a weekly basis. The third is to actually monitor the campaign as closely as we can, both, as I say, the physical campaign and the digital campaign, so we actually know what is happening as much as we can, and that's important. And fourthly, we can intervene if we feel we need to. We have the powers to do that in some areas, although we obviously use them sparingly. But for example, if we see that a certain company is offering people free meals or free drinks if they vote in a certain way, we can say, actually, you can't do that. And normally they stop, and we've had examples of that in the past. It's a very ancient law of treating, actually, but still, it does work. And all this, the key principle for us is transparency. We genuinely believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant for whatever's happening in elections. We try to practice that ourselves by publishing everything we can on our website, everything about the money and everything else we have, the registration of parties and so on. And we expect all parties and campaigners to do the same, to behave with transparency and integrity, which is a point we made after the recent controversy about a particular Twitter account. Now, having said all that, there's no doubt that digital campaigning is a major challenge for us, and we certainly don't pretend for a second to have all the answers to this. The problems are that much of it is not visible, as the previous speakers have pointed out. You can get an awful lot of bang for your buck on the internet and on social media. There's a level of micro-targeting which is extremely hard to keep abreast of, to put it no higher than that. And because there are, of course, all the risks that we've, again, heard about to some extent already about disinformation and outside interference. But having said that also, it's just worth reminding ourselves that digital campaigning, micro-targeting, whatever you like, is not illegal. And in fact, it's a perfectly good way of reaching people and engaging with people you don't always reach. And I think we should, again, bear that point in mind, not automatically assume that all of this is bad and so on. We often hear a lot of talk about dark money and dark forces and dark this and that, without really much evidence of that. So I think we should just be careful to keep all that in proportion at times. It's not to say the risks aren't there. They certainly are there, but let's just bear in mind that a lot of it is perfectly legitimate campaigning as well. In any case, we certainly do need changes to where we are now. We've recommended, as people have pointed out, quite a few ourselves over the past few years. Imprints is the most obvious example we've been recommending since 2003. Everybody agrees, the current government agrees, but they haven't actually done it, so we're still going through another election without their imprints, on digital content. We certainly need to have a much better service from the internet platforms, the major platforms, on their ad libraries. The ad libraries themselves are a good advance, and we talked to them a lot before they started to produce that, but they need to do much better than that in consistency in the way they report them to make them much more accessible. We have argued that we need to be able to ask the parties and campaigners for far more detailed records of what they spend in the digital campaigning area. At the moment, all they're required to do is say, digital campaigning 2.5 million or whatever it is. They don't have to provide any breakdown because that's the way the legislation is set out at the moment. We think that should be changed. I think that'll be useful. Wouldn't solve every problem. And by the way, all the spending rules do apply to digital campaigning, just as they do to anything else. Now, again, a lot of it can be very cheap, but if you do spend a lot of money on expensive hardware and software before the regulated period, before a year before the election starts, that actually has to be reported. If you use it in the campaign, then it counts as spending. So it doesn't escape the rules entirely. And fourthly, we've also argued that we should be given greater sanctions to ensure, because our maximum fine for an offence at the moment is £20,000. Other regulators, comparable regulators, can fine much more. It's not that we want to raise money and the money goes to the Treasury, not to us, but we think that it's just important that breaking the rules doesn't come to be seen as a kind of cost of doing business. I don't think that's the case at the moment, but we just need to be careful that doesn't happen. So all in all, obviously, we do need a lot greater regulation in this area. As I say, we're not claiming we have all the answers, but we're ready to play our full part in this in the future with the Information Commissioner's Office, with Ofcom, with others, the Advertising Standards Authority, or whoever. And we'll wait to see what happens after this election. I think there'll be a lot of lessons to learn. I think there'll be a lot of calls for action in this area. And we'll wait to see whether the government, if it's the same government or a similar government, whether they follow up and how they follow up on the online harms white paper they published a few months ago, because the electoral part of that is actually very important and has not been very much spelled out at the moment. So I think that's an area to watch for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A quick question from me before I throw it out to you in the audience, so do think of your short and sharp questions. Unusually for this election campaign, we've just heard a lot of violent agreement on various issues. There will be those people that say, well, actually, a lot of the practices that were corrupt have been going on for centuries, which a few of you have referred to. We've never known what campaigners are actually saying to individual electors. It's in the interests of some of these big data companies that are working with political parties to make grand claims about what they're actually capable of, and there may not always be the evidence there to support the fact that that's happening. Is there a risk of overreaction and moral panic in any of this?
Well, I think, as I suggested, I think there is a risk of that on the basis of what we know now. No, we don't necessarily know everything. That's part of the problem because there's so much out there. It's very hard to know whether you know everything. But the evidence, for example, of outside interference is not nothing, absolutely not. But it's not of such a volume and nature that you would think that something really bad has happened so far. Similarly, on the digital side, I would say that there are definitely worrying practices and worrying things that you can't necessarily see, but for the moment, it's not been something which has had a major influence on one of our electoral events so far. That would be my slightly my personal take. It's not really electoral commission view, if you like. But I think we do need to be careful. We don't go into the it's all terrible, and therefore everything that's happening is not real, and we're being misled, and the results of an election is not what it appears to be, or is not what it should have been if we hadn't seen these things.
Please.
I think the data practices are definitely new, and I know that Open Rights Group are doing really interesting work on this, and I think they're going to be helping people who want to do subject access requests. So we have GDPR to help in some way around that. But there is also there's something fundamental about I think people's motives, right, and the reasons why people might be engaging in sort of digital disruption in an electoral process. And I feel like sometimes we often talk about these things as if actors have a goal of influencing the outcome of the election, and that is sometimes the case, but it's quite often not. So, for example, during the referendum in Ireland, we saw organisations in the US blatant. I mean, they had their address in the Bronx on their Facebook page, targeting Irish people with signs that said vote one way or the other. And so this was something that we caught. We were able to escalate it, and Google and Facebook eventually kind of took they took some steps. But what we found then after that was that those same organisations were using the news reports of the interference in their fundraising domestically. And so for them, interfering in the Irish referendum process wasn't about necessarily influencing our constitution, and actually probably counterproductive. It had domestic financial motives. I think we saw this a lot with the Macedonian disinformation forums and all these other things. And so I think, to Sir John's point about transparency in the systems enables us to sort of figure these things out. But I think we need to bear that in mind as well, that there are different motives, and also we can't just think about, there was a study out I think yesterday, the day before, into whether or not Russian interference in the US election had an impact on the voting behaviour of people who saw it, and it found that it was sort of limited to no impact. But that's not necessarily the point. This is it's about trust. It's about trust in the system. It's about legitimacy of the result. And I think sometimes, there are some things that are fundamentally different.
Martin?
And I think there is a danger both of overreacting and underacting. What I mean by that is that I think there is a danger that we recognise that there are some significant problems, and we think that they can be resolved through some simple changes to legislation. Now, clearly there are certain specific things one can do around input laws, etc. But I think that the degree to which the scale of this transformation is such that I think if we think it's going to be solved by some silver bullet legislation, it's not. It really isn't. Not least because there are some complexities to it which, certainly escape my understanding. I mean, particularly to come back to the point about data, the extent to which data in some ways has become like a parallel currency used in campaigns, and people are accumulating it outside of the main parties, outside of the structures that currently exist, and developing software around it and developing uses for it, and then applying it in a way that it has huge value, but it's incredibly difficult to value it in the context of an election, and to supervise it, monitor it, and figure out what to do about it. So I think there are some really, really complex problems here, which, so in one sense, I think there is a danger that we think we can legislate our way out of it quickly. However, at the same time, I think there is a huge role for seeking to understand this environment a hell of a lot better, and recognising that probably our whole democratic system is going to have to change pretty fundamentally over the course of the next decade or two in order to recognise the changes that have happened in the digital environment.
Let's hear from the audience, but free speech is the starting point of any democratic election, and yes, some of the things that have been said about the risk to elections are exaggerated. I didn't hear any of them from this panel.
Thank you. I'll now take questions. I'll take them in rounds of 2 or 3. I'm going to try to gender balance the questioners, if possible, so please do put your hand up if you're even thinking of asking a question. If you could tell us who you are and where you're from, if you're able to. I know civil servants are currently under pre-election guidance. If you're in the overflow room next door, please do come to the door, and please do wait for a microphone to come to you. So hands up. Got 2 questions there, and the gentleman down here as well.
Hi, Terry Tilton from Democracy. You've spoken very much about campaigning and legislation around that. What about the basics, the real basic, concrete candidate information that is so hard for people to access, and the digital infrastructure needed around that? Who should be supplying that? We are a volunteer organisation. We have amazing people crowdsourcing information, and we're fielding complaints about people who don't feel they have enough information about candidates. So how could that be made better? Who should be changing that?
Thank you. And just next to you.
Hi. Hannah Williams, House of Commons. So I just wanted to bring up the discussion of the kind of imprints on social media posts and things like that. What is to stop, kind of technically unaffiliated companies like shell companies being set up so that the funding isn't directly linked back to main parties, say, or kind of main action groups, but there's still kind of influence in the election? And how would you stop that, I guess?
Thank you. And down the front.
Good afternoon, Mark Scott from Politico. To the panel, because there's some ongoing lack of transparency with all the digital campaigns, and even when you do have the data, it takes months, if not years, to gather it all together. How concerned are you that we're fighting the last war, not the current war? Thank you.
3 fantastic questions. Thank you. Who'd like to go first?
Okay, always looking at me. Well, on the first question, I mean, Democracy Club, I think you do a fantastic job, and I think we have quite a good collaboration with you in which we hope to expand in the future. I mean, it seems to me there is an awful lot of information out there. Of course, with the internet, one of the big advantages of the internet, you can find anything you want very quickly. So if people really want to find the information about who thinks what, they ought to be able to find it. So, I don't always have sympathy for those people who say, I didn't hear anything, no one tells me anything. You can find out if you want to. I suppose the problem is that people don't always make that effort. So how do you make that information easily available to them? And I think organisations like yours, and we're trying to do the same through our websites, but we recognise that not everybody's going to be looking at that. I think that is important. On the question about shell companies, I mean, that is a real concern because it's very hard for us. We don't necessarily have the powers ourselves to look behind what's there, particularly if the trail leads overseas, we lose that trail because we don't have the powers to investigate at that particular point. We can pass it to others, hopefully, who do. One of the suggestions we've made is that we should be starting to think about applying the kind of legislation or kind of provisions that exist in anti-money laundering provisions to the electoral field as well, because that might help to deal with that problem. One way of looking at it also is to say that any company which is doing that, for example, or making donations, has to be able to demonstrate that it generates sufficient revenue to justify what they're spending or what they're donating. I mean, that's only a partial solution, but that would help to expose it. And on the question of fighting the last war, I mean, I think, yes, we're always at risk of doing that. That's why governments find it so difficult to regulate in this area, because they can't keep up with the way the technology is changing. And if you find some regulation which is designed to deal with Facebook and Twitter, by the time the legislation's there, they'll have disappeared and been replaced by something else which will be of a different nature. So you've got to think about the principles of it. I think the only comment I would make again is that data. I mean, you're quite right, Martin. Data is the new currency. It's not always clear that again, having this data and trying to micro-target works. We don't really know, and even the companies who do it don't really know what makes people vote in different ways. So working out what the impact of it might be is extremely difficult. And it's just as difficult as it's always been with other things. So, we shouldn't always assume just because lots of people are micro-targeted, it makes lots of people change their minds. We don't know whether that's the case. And actually, most of the experts I talk to rather suggest it doesn't. Although it might make them more likely to turn out if they feel a particular way already. So, we just need to be careful about the way we talk about it and not to attribute too much power to these things.
No, I entirely agree with that. But to Liz's point, I think, which is a really important one, is that in most cases it's not about changing people's minds. It's about provoking a response, and that doesn't. That's maybe about voting. It may be about volunteering. It may be just about sharing or commenting or liking, so that you can then retarget and evangelize to their network. So I think we have to recognise the behaviour response, and actually there is growing evidence about behaviour response and what you can do in terms of targeted advertising, in terms of behaviour response. I mean, if I can just join the first and the third question, or try to, I think you've absolutely put your finger on an issue that really bothers me, which is the lack of positive intervention. And what I mean by that is the degree to which, it goes to what we were saying earlier, the degree to which we're sort of almost outsourcing some of the responsibilities for this to the platforms and assuming that they will take care of it. So I don't think it's happened in the UK. In the US, one of the things that Google did was when you wrote in the name of a particular candidate, they had an information box that came up on the right-hand side, and it had a whole series of issues, from transport, immigration, housing, and then a quote from the candidate to give you an idea of what that candidate thought. Now that was essentially curated algorithmically, but it was created by Google. So Google was making the decisions as to how that candidate should be represented and what quotes were best, most representative of that candidate. Now, it seems to me why should we be outsourcing that role to Google? And to the point about people can go out and find information. Well, yes, but I mean the problem that we have at the moment is about how people assess the trustworthiness of the information they're finding, and it's becoming more and more difficult, particularly as people consciously try and put stuff into the public realm which is deliberately distrustworthy. And it might be easier to find out the details of a candidate in an election, but I mean, try finding out the details of a candidate in the police commissioner's election, or one of the more minor elections. So I mean, to come to this fight in the last war versus the The next one, I mean, this is where I think we really need to start to think less reactively and responsively, because we seem to be constantly knee-jerk, oh, look, there's a crisis, there's a problem, let's deal with it, let's bring in legislation or rules to deal with that particular problem, when actually we should be looking forward and saying, okay, how are we going to, how do we want to preserve the real principles of the election, and what will that mean? And for me, at least, one of the things it means is not relying so much on the platforms, thinking about how we can positively intervene to, for example, create public spaces and public information that is more trusted, and you can source it, etc. And you can. So I think there is an awful lot we can do in a positive way rather than this always reacting. And just finally, just very briefly on the question about the shell companies. I mean, I think, and this might be a question we come back to, which is around, we haven't really discussed yet the difference between paid advertising and free speech. I mean, we have always in this country had a very, very big distinction from the US in terms of the constraints we put on paid advertising. And those appear to have disappeared online. And when we have discussions around, I mean, when we had the recent discussion around Twitter banning political advertising, most of the people who were speaking up for political advertising appeared to come from the US, and we speak on the Today programme slightly bizarrely, but the US has completely different rules to ours. And so there seems to be a big question around, what should we be doing in this country, given our political heritage, given the legislation that we've had in the past, what should we be doing about paid advertising online as opposed to free speech?
And that's where the bar is for the platforms. The bar for the platforms is trying to get up to the level of US electoral law, right, where spending money by corporations was deemed constitutionally protected free speech. And they are, to Mark's point, they are 100%, the platforms definitely are fighting the last war. And I think there's a risk as well that, this, the election that's upcoming, that we kind of, we end up fighting that war again, right? Will, you were saying not seeing kind of huge instances of sort of attempts at overseas interference or whatever. But I think the bar for UK and Irish electoral law needs to be, how would a border poll play out in the context of a digital the digital world that we live in, and the electoral law and other laws around it as it stands. And the UK general election doesn't keep me awake at night, but the thoughts of a border poll with the world as it is right now do keep me awake at night. I think in terms of the candidate in information piece, I think this is public broadcasting has such an important role to play in mitigating the chaos of the internet. And I'm not sure, I think the BBC is better than most, but in terms of sort of reimagining what a public information system means, right? Like in an era where we're sort of, we're moving beyond or broadcast, or at least broadcast plus. I know during the last general in Ireland, RTE gave every candidate who was running a 1 minute slot, and they had to stand in the same space. And they had 60 seconds to sort of make their pitch, and they had this nice little website, and it got huge amounts of traffic. I know obviously the scale is much smaller, but there are digital things that I think public broadcasters can be doing to be complementing. And I think, likewise to the question about tracing sort of corporate ownership, Sam Jeffers at Who Targets Me, I think it was yesterday or the day before, did some interesting digging into a group that was cleared by Facebook to be running ads called Third Party something or another, and they were targeting people in different constituencies, trying to get them to sort of vote for a third party and not for Labour. And he was able to look through Companies House and sort of do some of that digging and do it in real time. And I think this is where, electoral law should be enabling the transparency to allow civil society, including journalism, to sort of do that real time, and people who are incentivized to do some of that real time digging, before people vote.
Just briefly on the last question, regulation should be a proportionate response to clearly identified harms. And in an election, that's more important than ever, when free speech is the fundamental starting point for an election. The proposals we've heard from this panel about transparency of campaigning, transparency of advertising and so on, aren't fighting the last war. They're probably more like trying to invent radar. We don't know enough about what's going on full stop to identify what the necessary changes to election law are to have elections with integrity in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time. And so the first step in a proportionate response to that challenge is greater transparency and greater information about what's going on. It's very unlikely that that is the last step we will need to take. But until we've taken that step, we are fighting this battle blind. And on that point, of course, transparency of information about who's standing for the election is extraordinary that we do not have it. And it is only thanks to 20,000 wonderful volunteers at Democracy Club that that information is collected and made available for free and available for reuse. Full Fact very happily used the data collected by Democracy Club's volunteers to email every candidate in this election to ask them to get their facts straight, and many of them really engaged with that request. So I'd like to thank Democracy Club. I'd also like to throw a challenge back to the Electoral Commission and others. Why on earth do they exist in their current form? Those 20,000 wonderful people could be doing so much for our democracy. Why on earth is it collecting candidates' names?
It's worth noting there was a pledge which government was signed up to in a previous Open Government National Action Plan, which was to make candidate information available in a consistent data format that would allow all of this stuff to happen. So there is a question as to why that hasn't happened yet. I'm going to take one quick round of questions, so keep questions short. There's a lady there, there's a gentleman at the back, and there's a gentleman in the back row there as well.
Thank you. Chloe from ISD. Thank you so much for all of your comments. Both on this panel today and in the past 2 years in the UK, we've had a number of very, I would say, well-evidenced proposals for regulatory and legislative change in this direction from the ICO, from the Electoral Commission, and a number of independent groups. What is it going to take to incentivize politicians to actually, in some ways, self-regulate themselves and improve the situation that we've all spoken about today?
Thank you. Right at the back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Akshat. I'm from British American Business. So first of all, thank you for taking your time and sharing all these insights with us. But one thing that's jumping out is clearly a lot of these disinformation campaigns are really a transnational threat. So what do you think is the best way to sort of harmonize regulations and electoral laws with other countries and share best practices? What is the best way to promote that type of cooperation?
Thank you. And here as well.
Robert Hazel, an associate here at the IFG. My question, in part, has been asked by the lady across the aisle. It's very simple. Why do you think government and parliament have failed to act?
Thank you all very much. 3 more great questions. And members of the panel, if you want to wrap any closing thoughts into your answers to these as well, that would be terrific.
Do you want? Okay, so in a democratic election, politicians can be malicious actors. The biggest threat to an informed election this time round has been the people standing to form the next government. And they are, of course, the people we are asking to set the rules for our election. There is a clear conflict of interest there. There is an unavoidable conflict of interest there because these decisions have to be taken in an open, democratic, transparent process, which means that our politicians have to live up to their responsibilities and actually get on with this. If they're not willing to do that, then I think independent organisations are going to be promoting amendments in Parliament to legislation which isn't explicitly designed for this purpose. Full Fact has already drafted a private member's bill, which Baroness O'Neill tabled on this subject, I think, 2 sessions ago. So, yes, we are looking at ways of putting this on the agenda of Parliament, regardless of whether government wants to give time to it. But we should take encouragement from the fact that government proposed an election integrity bill, which at least has the potential to have the scope to cover some of these issues, and that the online harms white paper is wending its slow way through the government process. There are opportunities to discuss this, and we will be using them to the fullest, and I'm sure other civil society organisations will. For my part, I do not think the goal should be harmonising this across countries. I think Martin was absolutely right to say that, and Liz as well. Different countries have different democratic and electoral cultures, and that is a good thing, and those distinctions are important. The British attitude to TV advertising is very different from other countries. Both views, as far as I can see, are valid views of the role of free speech in a democracy, but Britain has a particular one. So the idea that you can have one set of election rules for all the different kinds of democracy in the world strikes me as far-fetched. And I think actually, I would advise national governments around the world to take unilateral action in this area. And then the internet companies in due course will come to them and say, well, what are the common strands we can find? How can we create more of a global consensus in this area? If we wait and try and build global consensus, we will delay action too long. It's time for unilateral action by every country. We control our own democracies.
I mean, I wish I knew the answer to why governments and parliaments haven't acted. Maybe we haven't been an effective enough advocate for change, although we keep banging on about it endlessly. privately and publicly. I would say one of the reasons is that parliamentarians in general in this country, and also the media, take virtually no interest in electoral issues, which is unlike other countries. I mean, when we look at comparable countries like Australia and Canada, they have select committees who are looking at this. They have, you know, there's a lively debate. For a lot of these areas in this country, there is not, and I can't really explain that to you. I just think it's a pity, and we, you know, one of the things we would like to do is to stir up more of a debate about that. I think it's also interesting that there are a number of proposals actually in the manifestos about this. I mean, they don't cover all the areas we've been talking about, but they cover some of them. So it may be this is a subject whose time has now come. And as I say, you know, we have been talking about the need for electoral law reform, for example, for a long time, and there is a sort of, to use an expression, an oven-ready proposal from the law commissions, you know, ready for Parliament to pick up if they want to, but so far they haven't wanted to. I think the idea of international harmonisation for the moment is, I entirely agree with Will, is for the birds. It just simply isn't going to happen. I think governments are going to have to legislate themselves. I think the interesting point is that just to recognise that only governments can do this. Only governments can set regulations for this, as in some other areas. And actually, when you look at what the internet companies are saying, they are saying, please regulate. Please tell us what the rules are, and then we'll obey them. They don't want to actually be taking, you know, they don't want to be the setters of the standards. They think that's a government's job, and, you know, governments need to respond to that and regulate. It's difficult because, for all the reasons we've been discussing, but I think that's the direction we're going to have to go in.
Yeah, so I think in terms of why governments have failed to act, I know what the Irish government are saying, that their reason they failed to act, and in part because this is led by the Department of Taoiseach, and he's been quite busy with Brexit. So hopefully, if you all can sort that out, then we'll make a bit of progress. But seriously, I think there is, and I guess this is reiterating what people have said. I think you know, the election commission here, similar bodies in Ireland have been asking for this for years. Politicians haven't acted, and I don't think sort of citizens, civil society, journalism ever have taken enough responsibility in pushing this up the agenda. So I think that's kind of on all of us. In terms of international cooperation, we might have a bit of disagreement on the panel. I actually think it's extremely difficult, at least in you know, if we separate out the debates, at least in relation to platform governance, I think it's extremely difficult for any government to act unilaterally, not least because of, frankly, the sheer lobbying weight of the company as it stands. Sort of it's very difficult to imagine any government outside the US. And I've talked to officials. I've spoken to officials in various places who say it is extremely difficult to do that. I mean, I think that's just the one bit of it, though, right? In terms of getting a set of standards for our expectations for platforms, in terms of what information we need them to put in the public domain about what's happening on their platforms. I entirely agree with both Will and Sir John that we don't want harmonisation of electoral laws. Every country has its own values. I mean, even Northern Ireland has its own particular set of rules to deal with the particular historical situation there. Which brings me to my final, just one kind of hobby horse of mine. I'm all for transparency. We need as much transparency as possible. I know there's a case in Northern Ireland at the moment which is looking at whether or not candidates' addresses need to be in the public domain. I think in a digital age, we've talked a lot about the information that we need in the public domain. I think there is something about the dynamics of being a woman in public life, and in particular in a context like Northern Ireland, but it seems to be pretty similar here. I think that's one of the things that we need to relook at in the context of electoral reform.
Thank you. Martin.
Well, in 30 seconds, because I know we've gone over. I always like to end on a depressing note. I mean, clearly there's a bit of turkeys and Christmas, and we see in every election cycle, and not least the recent ones, that actually a party seems to gain an advantage through using new digital tools, and then the other party learns from it, and then they seem to leapfrog, etc. And there is certainly an element of these tools are extremely effective, and why should we constrain ourselves? But I also think that there is both a lack of understanding and to a certain degree a lack of clear evidence, not least because an awful lot of it is held by the platforms themselves, about exactly what's happening and how it's happening and the effects that it's having. And without that clear evidence, it's very difficult to take very very concrete material action. I think if we see action at the moment, we're seeing it, as Will says, from the platforms themselves, which is kind of galling. But those are the main actors at the moment in this environment. And I'm afraid, I think as we've talked about a little bit, I think this is we're going to see this debate probably for the next 10, 20 years, so you can invite us back in 5 years' time. I mean, this is going to go on because of the scale of the transformation for an awfully long time, and so I think actually we're looking at a generational issue as well, and to a degree this will not, I don't think, be solved, or at least resolved, for at least another generation.
Inviting you back in 5 years' time, given how many elections and electoral events you might have, it might be sooner than that. A very quick parish notice before we go. This is one of a number of #IFG Election 2019 events. Do check out our website for the full listing. But just to tell you about one event tomorrow, which will answer the question of what on earth all of the manifestos mean. Rachel Sylvester from The Times, my colleagues Joe Owen, Nick Davis and Giles Wilkes, chaired by our director Bronwyn Maddox. That's tomorrow. Do sign up to that. All that remains for me to say is thank you to all of you for coming, but please join me in giving a huge thank you to an incredibly brilliant panel. Thank you.